Hi, everyone. Carl Steele here, English 4101, talking about the King of Tars. I have here an image from one of the surviving manuscripts of this Middle English work. This is one that's at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and you can see all the data down there. If you click through to the PowerPoint, which I'll share with you, this is a manuscript that's known colloquially as the Vernon manuscript. And here it gives this rather full title, and I'll read this to you in the Middle English. Here begins the King of Tars, and of the Sultan of Damascus, how the Sultan of Damascus was christened through God's grace. So if you've read the whole text by now, you'll see that there's a couple of things that aren't mentioned there. His skin color isn't mentioned. The transformation of his skin color isn't mentioned, nor is the strange shape of the baby mentioned, that miracle. It makes this work exclusively about conversion without any reference to a miracle except for God's grace. And that might be interesting for you to think about. When does this text talk about skin color and when does it not? I'm also interested in the title of this work in other manuscripts. Here's one that's in Edinburgh. This is a work that's called either the Auchinleck manuscript or the Advocates manuscript. And here it's just called the King of Tars. That's a thorn. Again, it looks like an L with a kind of a P shape on the front of it. And it's a TH sound is what it is, the King of Tars. And then we have this, written in very, very nice hand to read if you learn how to read this. Herknetume, both Els and Yin. It's a capital. That's an and sign. It looks like a 7 with a line through it, but it just means and. There's a yo. It sounds like what the name of the letter is. Yo, ying is how that's pronounced, like the word young in modern English. And there's that thorn again, and that's a W right here. So that's kind of fun. Something about this image. I'm going to show you on the next slide how, although it looks like this is the King of Tars, the Sultan of Damascus, here's the Princess of Tars, who's now married to him. It looks like they're presented as though they have dark skin, but this is in fact simply a discoloration of the ink over many, many hundreds of years. And you can confirm that by looking at other images in this manuscript and seeing places where characters are probably meant to be represented with light skin tone, and even their skin tone has become dark simply by a chemical process in this manuscript. But here's something else that's interesting to note. They're both dressed identically, so there's no attempt to differentiate them culturally on the basis of their dress, even though that's very important in the written text. But they also do a very common thing that you find in medieval Christian writing, which is, although the Sultan of Damascus is Muslim, they have him worshiping a statue. Here's a statue of a cow. And so they're sort of rendering him as though he's a pagan. And it's partially because they decided, many medieval Christians decided they didn't want to understand how Muslims actually believed. And partially it's a sense that Muslim worship, because it is so opposed to the worship of images, or the adulation of images, or the ascription to God of any particular human visual characteristics, that if you're a Christian, you might feel a little inferior to that, because you might think that your form of worship is somehow more idolatrous than Muslim worship. And so that's one of the reasons you find in a lot of medieval representations of Muslim worship, this kind of tendency to turn Muslims into pagans, to preserve the superiority of Christianity in a kind of anxious form, because here they are basically doing adulation to a statue of Jesus crucified. So that's interesting in itself. There's so much to notice here. So let me just show you from within the Auchinleck manuscript an image from later. It gives you a sense of what's happening with skin color in this manuscript. So this is, it's a very full manuscript, full of many, many stories. And here's an image of King Richard of England from a different story, King Richard I, or Richard the Lionhearted. And everyone here has dark skin, whether it's the Muslims here in this castle he's besieging, or Richard and his own, excuse me, soldiers. they all have the same skin color. So that indicates, I think, that we have a chemical process here, and that's why they have that skin color. Let me talk to you just a little bit about Middle English and also provide some quick interpretive readings of some of this. So this is talking about the princess's parents and how they respond when she finally marries the Sultan and leaves. And so I'll read it to you in Middle English, and then I'll translate it for you very quickly. I'll talk about some of the linguistic features and then give you a very quick interpretation, which I think is interesting in itself. So in Middle English, the king was in sorrow bound. The queen swooned many a stund for her daughter Dara. Knights and ladies there him found and took him up whole and soon and comfort him and fairer. Thus the queen and the king lived in sorrow and care, mourning, great dole it was to hear. Her car was ever a lich new, him changed both heed and hue, for sorrow and really cheer. So the king was bound in sorrow, the queen fainted many times for her dear daughter. Knights and ladies found them there and took them up whole and sound. So they picked them up after they were fainted, and they comforted them in company. Then the king and the queen lived on in sorrow and care, mourning. It was great sadness to hear it. Their care was ever perpetually renewed. They were worried about their daughter. And they changed in their complexion and their aspect through the sickness and sorrow. Basically, their skin color changes for sorrow and because of their pitiful mood. So there's a kind of medicalization of their skin color. And I think that's interesting in itself, because the changes in skin color, of course, so very, very important to the central part of this tale. And there's a kind of miraculous version, but here's a version where it's simply done as a medical thing. So that's probably worth talking about in class. So just a little bit about what's happening here in the Middle English, if you want to look at that a little bit for class. You're not obligated to. So the king was in sorrow bound. I'll just read it with a modern accent. And so you might expect in modern English, the king was bound in sorrow. That would be a modern English word order. So sometimes the verb follows the adjective and the preposition. Sometimes the adjective follows the noun. So the queen swooned many times for her daughter dear, rather than dear daughter, as you might get in more common modern English word order. And that sort of adjective following the noun is something you find really long after the Middle Ages used in poetry, and sometimes in song lyrics now. So if you've read Paradise Lost, Milton, 17th century writer, uses this all the time. Something else just about pronouns. Knights and ladies found him there rather than them there. So what does that mean? The H form of using pronouns, him and here, is how people spoke in the south of England in, say, the 13th and 14th centuries. And the TH beginning for these pronouns, them and their, is something that you find in Northern England in this period. And then as there's migration from Northern England into Southern England, the form of those pronouns changes. So now we, modern English people, use what was then a regional Northern pronoun form, but now it's the one that we use. And so we encounter this hem form, and that actually tells us something about where this poem was composed, because it's using a form that was at that time particular to the south of England, say in London, for example. Sometimes we have object pronouns preceding the verb. Them changed both hide and hue. So that's a little confusing, because them is not the they that you might expect. It's they changed themselves both in hide and hue. It's kind of a reflexive verb. So this is complicated, very complicated grammatically. So just have a look at this. This can give you a sense of some of the grammatical forms you might encounter in reading Middle English. And the pronunciation is one of the chief differences between Middle and Modern English, but also this kind of unfamiliar grammar and word order is also very different from Modern English. So talking just a little bit more about the larger sense of this particular poem, just to introduce you to some of the stuff. It's based on an existing story, and I've shared some of that with you. You can read that on my website and look at the translations of some of the other versions, and you can get a sense of what the King of Tars poem does with this existing material and how it transforms it. But there's a lot of unusual things in it because it's based on existing material. For example, the way that both the King of Tars and the Sultan of Damascus really just go wild with rage when they're frustrated. This is how kings typically behave in works like this. That's very, very common. The kind of nasty language about Muslims that you encounter in it, and very, very common in Middle English writing of this period. So it's that Muslims are called hounds or dogs, which is an obvious kind of nasty pun on the name of the prophet. And I won't say that, but that's out loud, but you can probably figure out how that works. And so it's really Islamophobic, I think. Well, but on that same note, the Sultan who wants to marry the Princess of Tars, he goes to war because his advisors lie to him. His advisors say that at the court of Tars, that they said all kinds of really terrifically nasty things about him and his faith, and that's not actually true. They're angry that he wants to marry the princess, but it's really, they don't actually call him a hound. That's not actually said there. What happens instead is that the King of Tars doesn't want this to happen, and he kind of gets really angry, and then he asks his daughter what it is that she wants. And that's a very important thing to note, the way the king is actually asking his daughter what her preference is. This is not unusual in writing for this period, and you can see a lot more about that in a dissertation that I helped supervise by Jennifer Alberghini at the CUNY Graduate Center, a work called Divided Loyalties, Family and Consent to Marriage in Late Middle English Literature, 1300 to 1500. And then I also want to note that in the first several hundred lines of this, you really have no idea that the Sultan is Black. That's not going to be mentioned until much, much later, which leads me to the last point in this very brief presentation. So in looking at a work like this is we can ask what distinguishes it from modern racism. I do think this is a racist work, right? It presents Blackness as a condition that should be cured. And so in the same way that Saif bin Diyatsan presents Blackness as a curse, even though it doesn't get caught up in that repeatedly. And it doesn't seem to worry overly much about Saif marrying dark-skinned women. It still fundamentally presents dark skin as a curse. And so we can look at a work like this and think about the way it's differentiated from modern white supremacist attitudes about Black people. So there's nothing said about the Sultan's intelligence. There's nothing about relative degrees of civilization. He's every bit as civilized as the people of Tars, and so that's significant. There's no strong sense of fundamental cultural hierarchy in the notion of primitive versus culture, something like that. But there's still a sense that bodies say something, that are meaningful, and that certain bodies are better than others. So the King of Tars, he has Blackness, and that Blackness has to be transformed or cured somehow. Whereas the Princess of Tars is presented immediately in the very first stanza as being as white as a swan, and which is clearly meant to indicate that she's of a superior social class or kind of human being. And so we can talk in class about how this is similar to or different from Saif bin Diyatsan, and I think that's worth looking at. So that's all I have to say for you today, and I'm looking forward to our conversation about this work over this week.